All right, so let's see if we're actually live now. Waiting for Eric to rejoin us. Um, so I probably should put a link to this in the other live. I really don't know why this is happening. Well, I don't even know if this is going to fix the problem. So first, let's see. Um, Here he is. Let's see if this is gonna work. Okay.
All right. Let's see how
Hello.
this. I also changed my speaker and microphone,
Okay, so I hope it's
so
working
I
this
cannot hear
time.
you.
What?
What
Holy
is going
mackerel!
on?
Whoa.
I haven't
So
yet heard the echo, but it was at
okay.
like a 10 to 20 second delay. So
Check. Everything is picked up on my end. Everything says it's picking up my
I'm
voice.
still not hearing an echo,
Uh,
but I'm not hearing anything. So
Here, I'm changing the audio input to see if that helps at all.
I'm gonna
Um,
try switching back to this.
I'm looking at every audio setting that there is here. It's the same as it was. And it seemed like it was working a little, at least. I mean, there's no echo, but check, it's picking up the sound
Let's
of
see
my
about
voice.
this.
Okay.
So I still can't hear you. Let me speaker settings. I'm not hearing the echo either. I'm not hearing anything. So
I can hear you perfectly. I can
okay,
hear you very well.
I can hear you now,
Oh, you
and I
can.
don't hear an echo.
Okay.
So I think we're fixed. Okay, whatever. I don't know what combination of things fixed it, but now we're fixed. So let's go. Let's be conscious. It's time. We were only
I,
semi-conscious for a while.
I had to start a whole new stream, so I hope someone puts a link in the other one. Um, yeah, I don't know. That was very weird. Of course, how else could we start a discussion about bizarreness and weirdness and skepticism without. That was all planned, Eric, obviously. Well done. Well.
I found with these tech things, it's like we have this when we do tech stuff for visiting speakers here at UCR. Something always goes wrong, but it's always something different from what went wrong the previous time. It's
It's
like
so true. It's
so.
true. I mean, I've been doing these since, with Google, when I first started doing these kind of conversations, I was using Google Hangouts. And one of the worst one I ever did was with Ruth Milliken. She, the call dropped 4 times. Um, oh, wait, someone is saying our Eric's audio is choppy.
My
And
audio
mine
is
sounds
choppy.
like it's doubled. Oh, no, so they're having the problem.
They're having problems now. I wonder if
But
that's
we
me
can
or
hear
someone
each other
else.
fine.
I can hear you fine.
I'm gonna hope that it works out in the long stream because this gets recorded and then hopefully it'll all. I mean, I can't. Everything says it's fine. The connection is fine. Um,
Here, I'm gonna change my.
What'd you do?
I changed my mic. How is this sounding?
Whoa. Yeah. Say something
Better?
again.
Yeah, I'm talking again.
Okay. How is it out there? I see a couple of people say that they're. Does it sound the same or different? I mean, the connection says it's excellent. The audio is picked up. All the settings seem fine. So I really am confused. Uh, check. Mike.
Yeah.
Um, the only thing that I did was switch to that. So can you still hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So I can hear you
I just
fine.
my mic had been on my camcorder, and now it's on my. Now it's this guy. So that might have been why it was choppy before.
Yeah, people are saying it's still choppy out there. I don't know how to fix it to be honest because it's working. I can hear you. Oh, it sounds great now, someone says.
Okay. All right. So let's just go, and
Yeah,
hopefully,
we'll see what happens.
we'll see what happens.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Eric, I was going to say we are live, but we've been live. People are confirming that we both sound good now, so that's very good. Thank you, guys. I was telling you I had a really bad experience with the Ruth Millikan call. She actually ended up having to. She's so nice, you know. She ended up calling on the
Yeah.
phone, and we talked on the phone. I recorded it, and then tried to sync that up with a video. It didn't work, but anyway, she was very nice. That was the worst one. So, phew. So, Eric, thank you for joining me and having this adventure.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who may not know you?
Right. So I'm a professor of philosophy at University of California, Riverside. I do a wide range of things, publishing all kinds of stuff. Consciousness is one of the main ones I've been publishing on. I think my first published paper on consciousness was in the year 2000, but I also work
All the way in
on
the year 2000.
yeah, way back. Yeah, so I've been working on it for 23 years. I also work on belief, moral psychology, classical Chinese philosophy, science fiction. So
Very
my
cool,
interests
yes.
range broadly.
And we like those interests. I've admired your work for a long time. I really like people who take a serious approach to seemingly strange ideas, which is, you know, one of the things that you might think philosophy is good for. Sort of
Right.
slow thinking in that old Russell way. So I really appreciate your work. And this new book that you have out, The Weirdness of the World, is a really fantastic book. So, you know, it's first I want to start with the title because when I told my 8-year-old son that I was going to talk to you about this, and I said, we're going to talk about how the world is weird. And he said, don't say that, Dad. Like that it was a bad thing to say or something. I was like, no, it's a good thing. That's the point of the book in a way. So, can you tell us about how you arrived, first of all, at the title of the book, The Weirdness of the World?
Yeah. I don't know how I arrived at the title, other than that once the title occurred to me, I'm like, oh, that's got to be the title. And almost everyone that, maybe not your son, but almost everybody, when I give them the title, they're like, oh, that sounds interesting. So, and unlike you, unlike what one usually encounters with presses, when I proposed the book to Princeton University Press, they're like, oh, don't mess with that title. We don't need to send it to marketing. We like that title.
Wow. Okay.
Um,
So, all right. So, what did you? Why were you
yes,
indicating the weirdness? I guess is what I was getting at, because many people might
right.
interpret that as a way of saying that if something is weird, then it's
Then
bad.
it's bad, right? Well,
Yes.
I liked the way that I like the way that you just said it, right? That you like philosophy for its capacity to think seriously about ideas that we might find strange, bizarre, or weird, right? And the book is really intended to be a celebration of that. So, um, I mean, the central theses of the book, which kind of, I hope the word weird kind of captures, is what I call the universal bizarreness and universal dubiety. And this is regarding theories of consciousness and fundamental cosmology. So, with respect to both kind of big picture issues, and I think they're related, which we can talk about if you want, something bizarre must be true. That is something radically contrary to common sense. Um, but, and this is the universal dubiety, right? Dubiousness. But we know one theory kind of compels our assent over all the other theories, right? So something strange must be true. We don't know, we can't know, at least
Mhm.
for now, at least in the foreseeable future, which of these strange possibilities is in fact the correct one.
That's
So the
interesting.
world is kind of weird in this sense, right? It's strange. It defies our sense of what's normal and expected and comprehensible.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's such a. I think people need to be challenged in this way. I mean, you kind of say in the book that you're expecting the pushback to come from a certain quarter, namely of people who thinking that this stuff is maybe that there's some kind of common sense view that captures some of these deep things. Maybe it's not fully articulated yet. Maybe it's not universally accepted, but that there's something in the background that a kind of sense that well, what would be normal as opposed to weird would be what we ordinarily think about the world before we think too hard. Is that a way of characterizing it?
Yeah, I think right. I think there are probably two main sources of pushback, right? One would be people who think that there is a common sense understanding of fundamental cosmology and consciousness that we can get to, maybe we're making progress to, maybe we've already figured out,
Mm-hmm.
and they can reject things that fly in the face of common sense. And some philosophers are attracted to that kind of view. And then I think the other source of rejection is a kind of approaches that say, hey, well, science has already told us all the answers.
Yeah.
So, maybe it's bizarre by the standards of common sense, but it's not dubious. We know kind of the fundamental structure of the world and how consciousness works.
Right. So the two work together in that way.
Right.
Right. So I mean, I want to ask I want to put a big overarching kind of question in your mind. You don't have to answer it yet, but I want to know sort of when I was reading the book, what I was thinking was it seems like on the one hand you have an argument that common sense is incoherent. It can't be really made sense of, and I want to talk to you about the details of that. But it seems like that's part of your argument, and I find that okay, interesting. But then in the other part of the book, there's a lot of parts of the book, but in another part of the book, you endorse a kind of 1% skepticism. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. But then what's the 99%? So the 99% is supposed to be something like the common sense view, right? Or not. But then if there isn't a common sense view, then what is it that we're not skeptical about? And I found myself kind of puzzling about that as I was reading. And so I wanted to get your kind of, your take on that. But maybe first I wanted to ask you, I mean, if you want to have something to say about it right now, that's fine. But if you want to think about it, I would also ask you about the details of this argument that there's no like common sense view about the mind.
Um, Let me answer that question because I do have an answer to that.
Okay, cool.
So, right. So in part of the book, I advocate what I call 1% skepticism, according to which we should have 99% confidence that the world is kind of more or less how we take it to be, and 1% confidence that some radically skeptical possibility is true, like that you're currently dreaming, that you're a brain in a vat, that you're in a short-term simulation, or something like that. Now, how does that fit with my saying the world is bizarre? The thought there is, and I guess this is pretty similar to some stuff that David Chalmers has argued, that there are some bizarre views. There are a lot of bizarre views. In fact, basically most of the bizarre views that fit within that 99%. So for example, suppose panpsychism is true, right? This is the view according to which everything in the world is literally conscious. That's bizarre, but from an ordinary day-to-day perspective, right? Yesterday exists, tomorrow exists. I'm right that there's a coffee cup here. I'm right that I'm that I'm talking with you. I'm wrong about the fundamental nature of consciousness, and I'm wrong about the fundamental cosmology.
But you're not a
Those things are
Boltzmann brain,
bizarre.
or you're not a brain in a vat. That's the idea.
Right, but I'm not a Boltzmann brain or a brain in a vat or currently dreaming or something like that, right? So the 1% skepticism is really reserving that 1% not for panpsychism doesn't fit in there, right? For example, right? Or other kinds of bizarre views about the nature of consciousness and cosmology don't fit in there unless they radically threaten our everyday knowledge in a way that I don't think the panpsychism does.
Right. Okay. So even idealism and these kinds of views are going to be in that 99. So I guess I was misreading what you meant by the 99%, because I was wondering if you had if the theist believes, you say you have to have some skeptic, open up the ideas, but where does what counts? Does theism count as one of the 99% or one of the 1%? So does seem like some value judgments are going to be.
Yeah, you're right. It's I should have been clear about that. Now in retrospect, I can see how that's confusing. But you're right. So to take another example, idealism, and this is the example that Chalmers uses to make this point, right? He says, well, he appeals to Berkeley, right? So Bishop Berkeley thought the only thing that exists in the world are minds and their ideas. There are no material objects at all. It's all kind of a big choreographed dance by God, right? So this coffee cup is just an idea in your mind and my mind and your viewer's mind, right? And there's no physical coffee cup out there, right? Now that's bizarre, but Berkeley says there's no violation of common sense here because coffee cups still exist and we're still having this conversation, and tomorrow is going to be just like you think it's going to be, and yesterday is like you thought it was. So there's no violation of common sense. So it's bizarre metaphysically, but it's not a radically skeptical scenario. right?
Right.
Because our ordinary day-to-day beliefs are not upended.
Right. So there. So in the 1%, what you're distributing your credences over is these ones. I mean, so it does make one wonder why simulations get there. I guess that's why you limit yourself to temporary simulations, not just
That's correct.
simulations. Right. Okay. Now I'm
That's
sort of
correct.
piecing it
So,
together.
right. So, in fact, David Chalmers and I have been going back and forth a little bit about this, and I've got
Uh-huh.
a forthcoming paper where I'm going to talk about this in more detail. But,
Oh,
right.
interesting.
So Chalmers says the simulation scenario is not a skeptical scenario, kind of for similar reasons, and he appeals to Berkeley as an example, right?
Right.
If you're in a big, stable simulation, then you're wrong about fundamental reality, but, you know, all your ordinary day-to-day beliefs still turn out to be true. But if you're in a small simulation or an unstable one, then Luxembourg might not exist. The world might have been created 10 minutes ago. The future might not exist in the way you think it is, right? And that is radically skeptical.
Right.
So then there's this interesting question, which is if we accept the idea that we might be living in a simulation, conditional upon that, how confident should we be that it's a large, stable simulation, which is a non-skeptical possibility, versus a small or unstable one, which is a skeptical possibility? And my claim is that if you think that, to whatever extent you think there's some probability we're living in a simulation, some substantial subset of that probability should be assigned to the likelihood that it is a small or unstable one, right? So
Hmm.
we shouldn't just say, oh, we're living in the sim, but I'll be fine, right? If we're living in the sim, it could very well be a short or unstable or small one, right? And so
Yeah.
we should be worried about that. We should hope that we're not living in a simulation.
Well, it counts as unstable because in the book you have that picture of God tripping over the power cord. Is that unstableness,
Right.
the power cord tripping? Does that indicate that that simulation is unstable, or is it something more about that there's no continuity in the laws, or something about the way the simulation is
Right.
run itself that makes it unstable?
Right. So if God trips over the power cord, right, then the simulation is small, it's short, it has a truncated future.
Mm-hmm.
Um, an unstable simulation would be one where the laws of nature change, or there are radical changes in the simulation of another sort, right? God
Yeah.
decides to,
Hmm.
release Godzillas all over the planet, or,
Yes,
whatever.
we sim players from the '90s remember this. Lots of disasters.
Right, heavily influenced by SimCity.
Exactly. I love SimCity. It's a great game. But so I guess so. The debate between you and Chalmers, then, and this is something that I guess we're skipping to skepticism, which is fine, because I want to come back, I guess, to some of this other stuff that about how there's no common sense view, or but anyway. So
Yeah.
this is an interesting issue because I guess in the Chalmers's book on this, he argues that you should assign at least a certain 25% or so probability to us living in a simulation. And one assumes that he defines it in a way that it's a stable simulation that's long lasting. And so I guess your dispute with him would be that that's too quick because some of that 25% has to be allocated at least to these unstable short simulations so that you can't really rule out. Is that the idea?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So he's, as Chalmers always is, he's really careful. So he's
Yes.
not slipping over that issue. Small simulations count as simulations on his view. And so he does agree that some subset of your credence, whatever credence you have, say 25% that you're living in some simulation, subset should be to small simulations, which would then be skeptical scenarios. And when he says a simulation is not a skeptical hypothesis, he's very clear to say in the crucial points, right? Assuming that it's large and stable.
Yeah, exactly. He says that right out in the book. He's like, look, I don't have. This isn't an argument that you can like refute that kind of skepticism. That's radical
Right.
skepticism on your use.
Right. So in that book, he is a little fast on the issue of, how much of our credence we should distribute to the smaller, unstable
skeptical simulations versus the large stable ones. It's more like he's saying, okay, let's just talk about the case where we're in a large stable simulation. That's not a skeptical case. And then he quickly presents some reasons for thinking maybe we are in a large stable one, but he doesn't really get into that in much detail.
Right. So some of those would be like the apparent infinitude of the universe or something like that, or that we can pretty much seemingly look at any part of it in any amount of detail we want, or well, I'm curious about what kind of reasons he might offer for thinking we're in a kind of stable.
He gives kind of a simplicity argument.
Hmm.
So he says something like, well, look, if you were to say it's one city, then you would have to have a really complicated set of scenarios for what to do when you get to the edge of the city.
Right.
And how do you simulate that so that people wouldn't be fooled? So people would continue to be fooled
right.
as they cross the border of the city and then come back. Well, you need to have all of this stuff in place in order to make it work with a kind of city-sized simulation.
So it's just very complicated.
It would be very complicated. In a way, it would be easier, just like run the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
So that's the structure of his argument, basically. And the structure of my reply is, okay, well, yeah, maybe that would be complicated, right? But think of all the resources that would be involved in like running a real large one, right? There's going to be a trade-off between, say, cost and simplicity here.
Yeah, interesting. So the way I'm thinking of it now is that so you could sort of buy Chalmers's argument that there's this like at least 25%, and also be a 1% skepticist, and say yes. So maybe part of that 25% is going to be 0.1 devoted to these temporary simplifications, 0.1 devoted to this whatever, and sort of all could sort of still work within itself.
That's correct.
But I thought you suggested in your book that you didn't think you could really get up to the 25% in the first place. But maybe that was maybe
Credence
now
living
thinking
in
you
a
were.
sim. Yeah, my credence that we're living in a sim is not as high as 25%.
So
right.
What do you? I mean, this is not really related to this, but what do you think's wrong with that argument? That why isn't it that high? Because you think it's just one of the bizarre possibilities, and we shouldn't have. Because you do say in the book, there's none of these things are compelling enough that we should go up to 50%. So maybe this is just that part of that argument overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things that would have to be true in order for it to be the case that we're living in a simulation. And once you kind of multiply these things by each other, you maybe end up with a lower credence than 25%, right? So you have to accept a certain kind of theory of consciousness for it even to be possible, right? You have to think that technological civilizations are stable and continue to exist for long periods of time after having developed high technology capable of running a sim. I'm actually a pessimist about that. I think probably the simplest answer, the simplest resolution of the Fermi paradox is that technological civilizations are unstable. You then have to
are you worried about the GPT arc? Is this part of your like that AI is gonna be a possible destroyer of humanity?
I think that's possible. My skepticism, my pessimism about the Fermi paradox is a little more abstract than that. It's more that basically, as you gain technological power, that is basically always a two-edged sword. Technological civilizations are going to probably almost necessarily have small living environments like planets. And if you get the increasing technological power, then one thing goes wrong and you make the environment uninhabitable for the beings in question, right? So I think my inclination is to think that the technological advance and reasons of efficiency will tend to cause technological civilizations to gain increasing technological power and increasing fragility, so that one thing goes wrong and it's over.
Right. So that you get this domino effect. So it's increasingly complex and then therefore intricate, and therefore many things can go wrong at many different points.
Right.
Interesting.
So there are two dimensions to this, right? One is just think about if you're a hunter-gatherer tribe, nothing that you do in the forest is going to wipe out all of humanity, which is spread across the globe, right? But the more power you get, the more there are going to be possibilities to wipe out all of humanity, right? So that's dimension one. And dimension two is, right, this intricate interconnection, right? So you could think about when one of the things that we've seen over the course of long periods of evolution is you get more and more complex organisms over time, right? You go from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, right? And then from eukaryotes to multicellular organisms, right? And then from multicellular organisms to kind of social organisms.
Right.
And with each of these moves, there is a certain kind of efficiency that you get by the specialization of the subparts integrated into a whole. Right? So we could think that at some point it will be useful for all of Earth to become essentially a single organism. And then one death is extinction.
Mm-hmm. For that interconnected.
That interconnected, right? So you don't need to necessarily buy this idea of, strictly speaking, an organism, right? But the idea of the efficiencies of interconnection, right? The efficiencies of specialization.
Right.
They're great. I mean, I don't have to be a farmer. It's great to specialize, right? But now I'm dependent on farmers, right? And as, again, just at an abstract level, right? As we get more power, more technology, and more specialization, then we get this efficient system, and there are reasons for rewarding efficiency.
Right.
Right. We get this efficient system, but the more efficiency, the more fragility. Oh, yeah, I mean, you saw a version of this just in miniature with the shipping crisis during the pandemic. Right? Shipping had become so efficient.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And then one thing goes wrong and it's chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
that wouldn't have happened with 19th century shipping.
Right. Yeah,
right?
it was much slower.
It was so efficient.
Yeah, exactly.
It was because it was so efficient that it was so fragile.
Yeah, good point. Interesting. So then, I mean, I'm wondering, like, where we keep, so the possibility of AI destroying us, like, in the near-term future. I mean, I've seen people saying, I'm not going to see my kid graduate from college because AI is going to destroy us before then. I mean, serious people that work in AI. I mean, I don't know, you may disagree with them, but people have said that. But it sounds like, so you think that part of the 1%, that we should assign some small probability to maybe some AI future thing. But this other thing is more probable to you. It's not. It sounds like you would have higher than 1% in this kind of solution to the Fermi paradox.
Right. So it's not AI concerns in particular. I think it's worth taking them seriously. I'm not thinking there's near-term catastrophic AI risk. But among the maybe longer-term risks, put AI in there for sure.
Yeah.
And technologies that we can't even foresee now.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's the real risk, is we don't know what's coming. But okay, interesting. So that's an interesting answer. I want to go back to this whole question about what's the 1% and what's the 99. I'm still kind of puzzled about it, but I want to go back to the stuff about the bizarreness of the metaphysics and accounts of the mind. So I think you do a good job of drawing out the quote, the bizarre consequences of all of our major theories. I mean, we have physicalism, we have dualism, and we have idealism and compromise, mixed views, basically. And each one of those has results which are seemingly at odds with common sense. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit what you think each of these things are. I mean, I think maybe this stuff is well known, but maybe it's not. So can you just tell us what you think each? Can you give us a synopsis, or is that too much?
So these 4 different kinds of theories? Sure.
Yeah. Of what's bizarre about them.
Well, let me first say the fastest argument for the universal bizarreness thesis is just an empirical induction.
Right.
Right?
No one
If
agrees.
you look at the history of philosophy, the entire history of philosophy and the whole planet, you will never see someone who has presented an in-depth positive theory of the nature of consciousness who doesn't commit to something radically bizarre. But you'd think that some people would be motivated to create a non-bizarre theory. People say, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Right? So the fact that one does not exist, despite centuries of effort across multiple cultures, is an empirical case, inference to the best explanation for the fact that it's not possible to create a non-bizarre theory of everything. And then one reason it might not be possible is if common sense is incoherent, then you couldn't create a coherent theory that respects every aspect of it.
So, Ken, just really quickly, so what does it mean to say that it violates common sense?
What it means is that there is some implication of the theory, it doesn't have to be on the face of the theory, but there's some implication of the theory that if you were to present it to non-experts, they would say, man, that is so strange. I don't think I could accept that. Right. So we already talked about panpsychism and idealism. So those are good examples, right? The idea that literally everything, including like a solitary proton at the edge of the galaxy has conscious experiences. People are like, that's pretty strange. I mean, that doesn't mean it's false.
Right.
But
exactly. No, we're not talking about whether it's false or not. Absolutely.
Yeah, it violates our ordinary understanding of things, right? Or Berkeley's idea that only minds exist. There are no physical material objects at all, right? Again, that's like pretty strange. It's a violation of common sense.
He claimed that he was on the side of common sense. So how do we, I mean, Berkeley is an interesting case, which, first of all, there's different kinds of idealism. So Berkeley has a particular brand of it. And I think the most popular one nowadays is like objective idealism or analytic idealism, which claims that the stuff out there is mental. But still, Berkeley's an important person. But he claimed to be on the side of common sense. Like, I only believe in what I can see. So it has, this weird implication. But why is Berkeley wrong that his view isn't a common sense view? According to you, I mean, I don't know who's right here. I'm just asking, like, what your view on this is.
So Berkeley admits that the ordinary person does not somehow, he says, wow, I don't know why people feel this, but the ordinary people seem to think that sensible objects have an existence independent of being perceived.
I mean,
isn't that strange that ordinary people think that? Right. So he acknowledges that his view is contrary in that respect to what ordinary people think.
Mm-hmm.
And when he's defending common sense, what he's defending is that houses exist, that hands exist, and that you have direct experience.
Oh, I see. So he's just defending the 99%.
He's defending the 99%.
Okay, I get it now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that that's. I mean, so some people are accusing us of only thinking that non-physicalist views are bizarre. But obviously that's not what you think, because you think physicalism is a bizarre view as well. But one wonders if it's as bizarre as these other views. Or if it even makes sense on your view to rank these things in terms of their bizarreness, and then one might have a preference that rose above a certain level, perhaps.
Right.
So I wonder, first of all, what's bizarre about physicalism, according to you?
Right. So I do think different views have different degrees of bizarreness.
Okay.
And idealism is probably more bizarre. Well, it's bizarre on its face in a way. The physicalism, I think, is maybe not bizarre on its face.
Oh, interesting.
It could be that the majority of the world population would reject physicalism, but merely thinking that something's false is not enough to show that it's bizarre. It has to be kind of a jaw dropper for it to count as bizarre. So I don't think either physicalism or dualism, where by dualism I mean the idea that they're immaterial souls, basically, right? I don't think either of them is bizarre on its face. Mm-hmm. What happens is, I think they're bizarre when you make theoretical choices and pursue implications of any particular implementation of physicalism. Right. So if you are, for example, a functionalist, which is maybe the most common type of physicalism, then you think, right, basically anytime you have the right kinds of causal relationships among things, you get conscious experience, and then you get these fun, interesting counterexamples, or
Yeah, exactly.
if they're not interpreted as counterexamples, right, bizarre implications, right? That if you organized all the people of China to implement the functional state of a brain for an hour, that group would be conscious, right?
Yeah.
Or John Searle's Chinese room example, right? Functionalism seems to suggest that you could create consciousness out of any kind of, well, Searle says, if you took beer cans and wire and powered it by windmills, you did it
Yeah.
in the right way, you'd have rich levels of conscious experience like that of a human, right? And that, I think that counts as bizarre.
Yeah.
Now,
I
you
mean,
might, if you're a functionalist, you could say, yeah, okay, that's contrary to common sense. People kind of scratch their heads when they think about that. You really think that? Right? That seems bizarre. But maybe that's the right view.
yeah, exactly. I mean, so the functionalism is a view that I always thought was just obviously kind of bizarre, in the sense that you mean it in the book. It really takes a lot of. I mean, there's a reason I think the identity theory came first, and then people sort of
Right.
moved away from it because it's sort of not the most natural view. But who knows? I mean, you could debate maybe
The
it's because.
identity theory is bizarre too, right? The idea that you have to have a brain in order to have conscious experience,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so much of science fiction is premised upon the assumption of the falsity of the identity theory, right? When aliens come to visit Earth, or when we think about robots being conscious, people are generally assuming they don't have brains like ours. They've got radically different
They have
stuff
those big
going on
brains
inside.
in a bubble above their head. What are you talking about, Eric?
Well, maybe some of them, right?
Yeah.
Um,
No, but right.
right.
But so this is one of the questions, one of the questions I had when I was reading the book. And maybe this is why you say that idealism is sort of bizarre on its face, because of what it says is like the table itself is mental. But see, that's the thing, is I wasn't sure if, according to you, the bizarreness of the idealist view was that the table itself is mental, or if it's the claim that the table doesn't have a standalone existence. Um, because you might think, well, okay, so you can have forms of idealism that say that it does, but it's just a mental standalone existence. That's the kind of analytical idealism, which I don't think you talk about in your book. But some people like that version. I think even, like Helen Yetter Chappelle has written on this, and then there's a lot of work, by Bernardo Castro and other people. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point, though, is that the thing out there could have standalone existence, independent of my mind, and still be mental. So I wondered if, like, the part that you thought was bizarre was of the idealist view was specifically related to the standalone existence, or whether it was to being mental, or to both.
Both.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, the standalone existence is maybe a little easier to understand its bizarreness.
I mean, so why I think common
But
sense takes a view
the
on this,
mentality
though.
of it is, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, why thinks common sense takes a view on this? So for my
This
when I
table is
talk to
mental.
students about this, like, and I
Yeah.
say we talk about idealism, and then I say, so the things in here, they're mental things, right? And they're like, no, and I'm like, they're like, what does it mean to be mental? And they're like, well, I can touch it, I can feel it. And you're like, great. So when you go home and dream, then there's physical things there, right? Because you're touching them and feeling them. And they're like, well, no, that's different. So, but in what sense is it different? It's the common sense view is like the physical is what can be touched. Isn't that the common sense view? And that's sort of what Berkeley's point, that's what he was on about, was like, no, the common sense view is that you see the stuff. It's right there, not that it's hidden from you and you see it by seeing
Right.
the. So I don't know to what extent, like, this matters too much, but it does seem like an issue.
Right. I mean, I think to say that a table is a mental thing and not just a material thing in the whatever sense of material, an object of physical study or something like that,
Uh-huh.
is to violate our common sense understanding.
Right. So,
I
but
don't
is this? So this is
think
something
people you think of
I'm sorry.
tables as mental things. No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
no,
Go
I
ahead.
agree with you, but this is something I wonder about, because lots of people will say that humans are not animals, and then I find that very bizarre. I'm like, I mean, in a different sense of bizarre, I find that a very strange
Yeah.
thing to say, that humans are not animals. It's like, So usually I will say, well, what are we, rocks or minerals? Like, what else is there around here besides rocks, minerals, animals? So what they mean, of course, is that we're a special kind of animal, not that we aren't animals at all. That there's something special or unique about us. So I think that when a lot of people are like thinking about mental and physical, they're doing something similar as with animal. That they don't really mean that the mind isn't physical. They just mean, or I think they think, well, what's physical is what you can touch, and then I can't really touch the mind. It seems to me, so it seems maybe not physical in that sense, but a special case of the physical maybe, or maybe that's a special. So I don't really see common sense as really committing or being shocked by these kinds of. I wonder why it's like. So yes, an average person might not have thought about that and be like, I was assuming a different view, but to say it's shocking or bizarre or something seems more strong than that. I was assuming a sort of a different view. Maybe the idea is that common sense doesn't have a coherent view that it's assuming.
I suspect that it is more commonsensical to think that there's something non-material about us. But I don't think common sense is necessarily firmly committed on that. What I do think is a violation of common sense, which is bizarre. What is bizarre is to say something like, oh, well, mountains are mental entities. Right? The mountain, right? If no human or conscious being had ever evolved on Earth, there would still be mountains. Even if there's no mentality around, there would be mountains. If the idealist says mountains are mental entities, they seem committed to denying the existence of mountains unless there are minds around.
Right.
I
think
if
like the universe is a big mind or something. So that's very bizarre. So we're going to be exactly. So that we're not saying these views are false. We're just trying to say that they're committed to something.
We're just saying it's not the common sense picture.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. The idea. You could say, oh yeah, well, there are mountains before humans because there were minds always on Earth because maybe the universe is one big mind, or even mountains have minds or something like that. But now you're, by the standards of mainstream contemporary Anglophone thinking in our culture, it is that's something that's kind of a bit of a jaw dropper.
So do you think, I don't want to get too distracted, but if you were raised in a certain society, could you have I don't know why I'm picking on idealism, because I think you said that was more bizarre than physicalism, but could you, if you were raised in a certain, very orthodox, meditation focused, the endorsing the emptiness of all terms, so very, very strict sort of version of a kind of Hinduism or something like that, or Buddhism, depending on the view. Could you then have, if you were just in that little monk confined area in that community, would idealism be the common sense view? If you were raised there? Right. So it just depends really a lot on what...
Common sense changes.
Mm-hmm.
So I have two observations about this, right? One is, despite the fact that common sense changes and is culturally variable, I still think, I'm open to hearing a counterexample, but I never have. I still think it's true that every well-developed cosmology of consciousness has violated the common sense, both of its era and of current mainstream Anglophone thinking, right? So if you go, for example, for Buddhism, right? The Buddhists, they did not see no self and dependent origination as common sense, right? They recognized that there's like a common understanding of things, and then there's the Buddhist understanding, which is very different. Right. So that's one observation. The other observation is, yes, common sense changes, and it could change radically. And by common sense, I kind of mean at the group level, and individuals have different ideas. My favorite example of common sense changing is Copernicus. Right. So at the time Copernicus suggested the Earth moved around the sun, that violated common sense. Right. Right. Everyone's like, the Earth is not moving. It is obvious that the Earth is not moving. Well, this is a bizarre thing to say, that the Earth is rotating around that thing up in the sky. Right. But now it doesn't violate common sense. Right. We've come to accept that.
Right. So I guess
common sense could change.
So, and part of the reason why I think this matters, maybe because, if we think that idealism is more bizarre than physicalism, even though physicalism has some bizarre implications, not right on its face. You still might think that that's largely a product of the culture that we happen to find ourselves in, where everyone is very science obsessed and so forth and so on. So even saying that that's like less bizarre is not a point really in physicalism's favor on your view, right? It's just basically saying something about the background assumptions of the average person or group of our society at this time. Or is it saying anything more than that?
I think it says a little more than that.
Okay.
So if you thought we had a good method for answering these metaphysical and cosmological questions that didn't appeal to common sense, then you could say, oh yeah, so what? Common sense says that has no bearing on what we should believe. But in my view, the problem is we have basically 3 methods for trying to settle these questions, and none of them are any good. So despite the fact that common sense kind of stinks, it's one of basically 3 broad approaches we have to try to deal with these issues. And we're going to try to deal with these issues. We kind of have to some extent count violations of common sense as a strike against a theory. Now, it's not going to be a definitive strike against a theory because every theory is going to violate it to some extent, right? And I don't think it's like we bring out our common sense-ometer and then just like, okay, whichever one violates it least is the one we're going to choose, right? Because there are other reasons. I mean, the other methods we have, I think, are kind of science as we understand it, right? But there's not like a straightforward scientific test for the truth or falsity of panpsychism or the truth or falsity of functionalism about mentality. I mean, we could talk about that if you want, right? But I don't think there's a straightforward scientific test for questions of this magnitude. There is scientific evidence that kind of bears on it, that makes certain theories more comfortable than others in certain respects. But you can't just like, okay, tomorrow we're going to test and figure out whether panpsychism is true.
Well, and panpsychists like Goff and them explicitly say that they are, saying nothing that can ever be tested or is incompatible with any scientific findings. So that's kind of their view. Is like
exactly, right. And Rudolf Carnap, he says, well, look, an idealist and a materialist measuring a mountain, they're not going to say there's some difference in the measurements, right?
Right, exactly. Right. The soul of the mountain weighs 9 grams, Eric.
Right. I mean, there is some empirical evidence that's relevant. For example, if you think they're immaterial souls, some people have thought, okay, well, maybe we can weigh these things, right? And see if the body gets a little lighter after it dies. Or maybe we could try seances and see if we can communicate with these things, right? And as the evidence comes in negatively on that puts a little strain on certain versions of substance dualism, but not all versions of substance dualism, right? So it's not like it's irrelevant. Yeah. And then the third thing is something like theoretical elegance, fruitfulness, those kinds of things.
So philosophy doesn't even come in here as one of our methods.
Well, philosophy is the big picture thinking about anything. Okay. So I think philosophy already is in it from the beginning, right? As soon as you're talking about the most fundamental big picture issues, whatever tools you're using, you're doing philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a secret harboring for a desire for there to be a philosophical method. It's that kind of is not distinctive of philosophy, but maybe a way of doing philosophy or something. And I sort of think that what's distinctive of that is like commitment to the idea that an argument counts as evidence. And not everyone accepts that. There are a lot of people who think that no, arguments are not evidence. They shouldn't count as like the kinds of things that you bring up. So what counts as an argument, we can argue about that. Or, is it only formal arguments or inductive arguments? We can argue about that. But I think that sort of the philosophers are committed to the philosophical method depends on this idea that if you give an argument, there's evidence that you should accept the conclusion. So that seems sort of like an important thing. Obviously, you're probably going to say that's just part of rationality or something like that. But
that's my inclination.
Yeah. But so other people are going to say no that
by evidence, but
yeah. So evidence means it depends. I think people will disagree about that, but I think people who might say this are going to say it's going to increase your probability that something is true. So abstract reasoning or arguments that from premises that you don't know whether, like for example, simulation hypothesis, starting with speculative premises and then reasoning to a conclusion that's you're now supposed to put some credence into, that's not based on experience or anything that you've seen, but actually these abstract arguments. I think a lot, maybe not a lot, but I think some people are skeptical of that as being something that you should take serious. And I mean more than just empiricism. I mean, although empiricism is related, I mean this idea that the reasoning itself is kind of an inadequate reason to believe the truth of the premises, given that we don't know the truth. Excuse me, the truth of the conclusion, given that we don't know the truth of the premises. It's very abstract and speculative.
As long as we have some degree of credence in the premises, we put them together and get to a conclusion, then we probably ought to have some degree of credence in the conclusion, maybe multiplying the credences of the premises together or something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm just saying
That
I don't
just seems
think
like
it's
rationality to me. Yeah.
Yeah, well, all right. So so this idea that physicalism is less bizarre, it's kind of related in a way to the point I was just trying to make. So I couldn't help but notice that the bizarreness of physicalism relies heavily on science fiction, and that there aren't, as far as I can tell, any real like empirically motivated cases of bizarreness, except for very specific versions of physicalism, like maybe the type identity theory, which says there has to be some common brain state between me and an ant and a octopus if they feel the same state. So that's, you're like, same brain state? Huh. Well, okay, so you can maybe work your way to believe that, but that takes work. But so other than that, like the idea that the mind is physical is counterexampled not by anything we've ever seen, but only by those things which are fictional. And you can specify the fictional cases and reason about them. But it seems, I guess I would say, if I was to really try to push back on this view, which remember, I'm very open to I'm not really more interested in what you're going to say than I am trying to really make this point. But if I were going to push back on it, I would say, well, that bizarreness really should be discounted in a sense because of the skeptical nature. I mean, that's extremely speculative nature of the counterexamples, Antarian, Antheads. Things of this nature are very cool as far as stretching your mind out. But this might be the difference between swallows and moles, and I know you read that Edouard Machery review, and there may be something, I don't know, in the background related. When I read that, I was like, okay, so maybe this is sort of what I was thinking about in a sense. Because it does sort of seem like, in a way, you can make up the counterexample if you get to not really worry about, like, have we ever seen it? So I agree that we want to leave some room for those things out there. Now, I don't want to be a neural chauvinist in the sense you define as like ruling them out from the beginning. Even if they showed up, we would say no to their having a mind. But I do wonder like what like really level of credence we should give to this hypothesis, given that, well, there are no counterexamples on Earth that we know of. And well, yeah, I mean, specifically not only to the idea that consciousness is physical, but to that it involves brains. So I wonder if you think that this doesn't matter as much as maybe I do, or what your response would be to someone who says, yeah, that's maybe strange to say Commander Data doesn't have conscious experience. But then in the Star Trek world, it's just kind of not a possible world, but so what? I mean, fiction's full of all kinds of stuff like that. So how serious are we supposed to take this stuff? I mean, until Commander Data shows up and says, hey, jerk. Why are we really supposed to like think that physicalism is bizarre for making this commitment?
Right. So I guess I have two thoughts about that. One is, I think hypotheticals are fair, right? So if your view has the implication that if there were such and such a case, it would be an entity who is conscious, or it'd be an entity who is not conscious. And we have a kind of pretty compelling intuitive feeling that that's the wrong decision about that case. Then your theory has that bizarre implication, even if we haven't encountered that entity yet. As long as it's I'd say, physically possible, naturally possible entity. So in that sense, I do think the speculative cases are fair, right? Your theory says if we came across this kind of case, it would be conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, well, no, it wouldn't be, right? Or that's their strong intuition, right? Then that's a bizarre implication of your view.
Uh-huh.
Even
So
if we haven't run across that yet. That's strand one of my responses.
okay,
I've
let me
got
hear
another
strand two. Okay.
Strand two is some of the cases are not hypothetical, right? So I have this whole chapter on whether the United States is conscious, right? So the United States is not a hypothetical entity.
Uh-huh.
The United States is a real entity.
Right, okay. I see where you're going with this.
And right, it's got higher order representations, for example. It's got lots of information processing, complex responsiveness to its environment. Right? If you take the kinds of standard things that physicalists or materialists say about consciousness, it looks like the United States kind of has those things. So either you have to develop your theory in a way that excludes the United States consciousness, or you say, okay, well, look, it has these things, so it's conscious. Now I take the consciousness of the actually existing United States as a group over and above the consciousnesses of its members as a kind of bizarre possibility, something that would be contrary to our common sense understanding of things, right? So that's a non-hypothetical implication of a broad range of standard materialist approaches to consciousness.
Interesting.
And then when materialists try to wiggle out of that implication, they end up sometimes, often, I think maybe perhaps inevitably, adopting different bizarre implications in order to get out of that.
I mean, yes, I agree. I like the U.S. argument. It's very cool. It targets, I think, functionalism, and you bring this out nicely in the book, where you say, okay, so well, you got to say something special about brains, then, if you want to be a kind of physicalist who denies this. There's got to be something special about brains, and in fact, there are many special things about brains, and most of the things that you point out can be like addressed in this way, like information processing, blah 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 blah. But, I've always been kind of a secret fan of the kind of block style thinking about this, which is that there's one thing about the brain which is super surprising, and the U.S. doesn't do it, and that's this transfer of mediums from electrical signaling to chemical signaling at the synapse, which seems completely bizarre, completely unexpected. When people discovered it, they just thought it was completely that can't be the way the brain works. I mean, I read this book, it was The War of Soups and Sparks, which was the whole debate about whether electrical activity in the brain was there, how it worked, whether or not it was some other thing. So there was this whole, this went well past, Eccles denied this kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, that's in the 70s, I think. That's not too bad far back. So the idea that this works this way was extremely counterintuitive, and people, thought you could give a priori reasoning, like our reflexes are too quick and doesn't blah blah. So it just turns out it's wrong. So it's a very interesting and unique feature of the brain that there's this kind of electrical signal that is then transduced into a synaptic chemical signal, then back to electrical signal. So I don't know. That looks like something. That's itself pretty bizarre. I guess you say that consciousness has to do with something about that. It's.
I do think we might, think about hypothetical cases and drawing out the bizarreness of that, right? So if we met a naturally evolved alien species, right? Again, this is just a hypothetical, but I think if this is an implication of the view that's bizarre, then you have to say that the view has bizarre implications. Mm-hmm. We met a hypothetical alien species that only worked electrically and didn't have the chemical synapse, right? Instead of having, calcium ions, and almost identical to us, except instead of calcium ions there,
exactly.
It's just the electrical
potassium and calcium, man. That's where it all comes down to. No, I agree. It sounds very strange. Look, it
acts just like us. It's got a brain virtually identical to ours, except instead of calcium, potassium channels, it's got electrical channels all the way through. And you say, oh no, they're not conscious, right? They say, wait, we're conscious.
Yeah.
They speak in language. They seem to experience pain. They talk about their dreams, and you say, sorry, no calcium channels.
Yeah. But see, that's not an actual example, though. So that's kind of what I was.
It's a hypothetical implication of the view, and I think if the view has counterintuitive hypothetical implications, then you got to accept that it's got bizarre consequences.
So I want to. So first of all, that's what I would say about the U.S. as being an actual case. I'd be like, okay, so they don't have brains. What's special about brains? Well, here's one candidate. Okay, so maybe it's not. I mean, I've become more friendly to functionalism in my old age, but this is my last diehard, like probably what I thought of as common sense view. The common sense view being that consciousness has to be like dependent on the brain somehow. Like the things which have minds are the brained things. And, it seems to me that there is a kind of a common sense prejudice towards maybe life, but I think more specifically brains with respect to these things. So, but the counterexample that was here was not a counterexample to that. It just pointed out the counterexample to that was like the fictional one again. So
Right.
if you're like
Again, that's
weighing,
correct,
but
right?
hold on, Eric. I mean, I didn't mean to cut you off, but just to finish the
No,
idea,
no, that's fine.
the so if you're weighing all your evidence and you're like, where do I sign? How do I adjust my beliefs? And you look around Earth, you look here, and you don't look
Yeah.
at commander data, and you don't care about Antari and Athens, and you say confined to here, what's here? Probably you should conclude it has something to do with brains. Um, or maybe life more generally if you want to get trees and their underground root systems in and stuff like that. So then you bring in all these other things, these conditionals, which I agree are invalid implications of the theory. And then you go, okay, so do we see anything like that around here? No. Could we, in the infinite extension of the future, find something like that? Yes. But is that supposed to impact the common senseness of the gee, look around here part of the earlier part of my rant? Because I think the gee, look around here part is playing a big role. And just to finish the rant, if you talk about
Yeah.
water, like, okay, so water is H2O. Well, aren't there similar bizarre consequences to water being H2O on your view, in that, in the infinite extension of the universe, there's going to be some bizarre implications, like dry water. There's the possible world of dry water where H2O is not a liquid, it's a sandy substance. Well, gee, okay, so is accepting water now as H2O is a bizarre thing? Huh, I thought it wasn't. So it does seem to me, I wonder, like, how, and I don't mean this as an objection, I'm just curious to flesh out your view on these things. Although I think of it as kind of a way of getting physicalism ahead of the others slightly, because you don't have to invoke common sense. I mean, excuse me, you don't have to invoke science fiction in order to get the violation of common sense with any of the other views. But you do have to invoke science fiction to get the counterexamples to brains. And that seems to me kind of like an important difference. It's either a consequence of our parochiality or some kind of significant thing.
Yeah. I think that might be right. I mean, my preferred position is physicalism or materialism if I had to make a wager. Um, and maybe that is an advantage of it. I think, right, with idealism and dualism, you can kind of prove pretty quickly that they violate common sense. Idealism violates it on its face. Dualism produces what I think of as what I call the quadrilemma of ensoulment, which we could talk about if you want, where I think common sense has got to be violated right away. Whereas physicalism, it's a little fussier to get to show how it violates common sense, and I don't have an in principle argument that all physicalist theories must violate common sense, and it does to some extent turn on these hypothetical examples, if you accept certain versions of physicalism. So I think I can accept what you're saying. I do want to point out, though, that when we think about what's so special about brains, the more obvious candidates for what's so special about them are things like that they coordinate sophisticated environmental reactiveness,
Yeah, no,
that
I
they
agree.
store complex information, right? And it kind of seems like that's more likely to be the kind of stuff that should matter to whether something's conscious than, oh, it's got an electrical chemical shift, right?
But
That
why?
sounds like, right. So if you think about,
But
right. So if
why?
you
It's
think
not. It's
about,
what matters to gold. What makes something gold is its electrical chemical stuff. Why wouldn't the same be for consciousness? Well, it's this. It's a kind of physical stuff. That's what physical stuff is.
let me give an analogy, right? So there's these old racist theories that try to rank the races. So they try to figure out, okay, in virtue of what are the whites superior to the Asians and the Asians superior to the blacks,
Oh no.
right?
Yes, I
And they
don't
try to
like
find a
this.
physiological thing, and they say, oh, well, if you look at the distance between the belly button and the bottom of the crotch, it's I forget whether it's higher or lower for the Caucasians and medium for the Asians and the opposite for the blacks. So that's the thing, right? So if you're looking around, kind of trying to find the physical thing, I mean, but of course that's absurd, right?
Right,
But it's a
obviously, yeah.
post hoc. You're trying to find the thing that gives you the answer that you want, but it's not a thing that seems intrinsically like it should matter. Then there's some reasons to worry about your method, right? So that's what a little bit what I'm worrying on is going on here, right? You are trying to say, okay, we know that brains matter. We don't know why they matter, right? But if we choose this thing, then we get the result that we want, which is that the United States is not conscious. Somehow we know, and it's
I
a
was actually
priori
more
the United
saying I
States.
think it's a common sense thing, which is to say that like it's some kind of thing which has a nature, and science, and we can find out what its like physical nature is. It's not common sense that it has that nature, but that it's kind of just like the other stuff around here. Um,
The fact that gold has, a certain number of protons and thus electrons and thus bonds in certain ways, right? You can see very quickly how the number of protons is super relevant to all the stuff we care about with gold,
uh-huh.
right?
Well, I
It
think you could
is
debate
not
that,
in the
but
same
I
way.
agree. Yes.
It's not in the same way clear how it's relevant that the fact that you've got electrical to chemical conversion across the ion channels is relevant to the stuff that we care about in consciousness, which is, I think, the stuff that we care about that's revealed by these hypothetical examples are things like the capacity to engage in sophisticated environmental responsiveness, represent oneself at a higher order level, throwing you a little bone here, right?
Hey,
Uh,
I'm not a true
right?
convert of higher order
Store
theories. It's
information, right? That kind
just
of that kind of big picture stuff seems like what we care about,
yeah.
what we think about when we're thinking about what kind of entities are conscious or not, right? And if we say, well, it's because of this little specific physiological thing, unless there's a story for why that physiological thing is super important to the big picture thing, like there is with the protons and gold, right? Then it's a little bit like the belly button case.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, but first I just want to say for the higher order stuff, like I'm not committed to the higher order theory. I think that we don't know which, if any, of the theories that we have about consciousness relating to the neural correlates of it or how it relates to in the brain. I don't think we know. I think higher order theories are misunderstood a lot, and people think they can dismiss them out of hand. So I get sucked into arguing
Right.
and defending them. But I don't really think. I mean, I think it would be quite surprising if consciousness in the brain turned out to correlate with a thought or anything cognitive. Although I think it's a possibility. So yes, the bones are appreciated, but my own view is that these are things are much more complicated, and we don't really know. So I'm on board with the not knowing part.
Yeah.
The only thing I was sort of pressing on was the universal dubiety, which relates to the universal bizarreness. So I was thinking, yes, you physicalism is bizarre. It's one of the bizarre things, and I like this idea. In fact, in this quote unquote book I've been working on, I start off by saying higher order theories are one of the bizarre things that could be true as per this argument that you make. And I cite your book and say, everyone should know about this. There probably has to be something that's bizarre about consciousness that's true. And people should get off their high horse thinking that it's not that way. I think it's absolutely the case that you're right. However, what I was thinking though also was like, how bizarre are the various options? And isn't our dubiety related to them? So you say there's no reason to get above 50%. But it sounds to me like we sort of have arrived at like a 75 split the rest 25 because of the science fiction sort of
Yeah.
examples and because of the gee look around here nature of like consciousness is innocent and wonderful. I have it. It's here. What other things appear to have it? The things that behave and move in ways that are interesting. What do they have that I have? Brains. What are the things that don't do? I mean, to me, it was a marvelous and wonderful fact to find out the spiders had brains because I just couldn't possibly imagine it as a kid that a spider had a brain. Like I was to me, it boggled my mind. When I'm not joking at all. When I learned this in school,
Yeah.
I was like, wait, worms have brains? Wait, spiders have brains? Wait, brain. So maybe that's why I've been obsessed ever since then. But I just felt like it could have been anything in there. It could have been water pipes. It could have been
Yeah.
cans roaming around.
Yeah.
It could have been tiny little worm insects writhing in a weird way, like your Antarian ant heads. But it wasn't. And over and over and over again, it wasn't. In the worm, in the spider, in the dog, in the cat, in us, in the octopus, everywhere you look, it could have been so, like, according to your view, it just could have been so different, but it isn't. So it's got to be something about either really weird about here, but here seems pretty typical if you look cosmologically, not in terms of life, but in terms of composition. It seems pretty typical. There's nothing really bizarre or exotic here on Earth that you would expect to only find in places like this or something like that. So it just seems like it could have been this. We should have opened up the head of the spider and found anything in there, but we didn't. We found neurons working in this way. And yeah, you could tell evolution or something like that, but still, one place somewhere. Why? But we haven't found anything like that. Now, that doesn't mean that I think it's impossible. I just wonder, like, in the grand quest for things that we're looking for, in the search for life, like, it would be very surprising to find something that wasn't having a brain that was moving around. We would adjust our views, but yeah, I think it would be a shock to, like, most of Earth to find the kind of, even just like silicon based, let alone, not even computer based, or not even like ant heads, or but just something with not brains, but that had behavior like ours. I think we'd be blown away by that, because it's part of common sense that that's doing it.
What do you think about? I mean, again, we're getting hypothetical cases, but increasingly less hypothetical
Yeah.
about robots, right? So it doesn't seem like it requires that much conjecture to imagine a robot that moves around and responds with a similar kind of sophistication to, say, a frog
Mhm.
to its environment. Maybe we're getting near that. I mean, it depends on how much sophistication you think a frog has and how optimistic you are about technological development, right? That would not be a brain in the sense I think you mean brain
It would
that would be
not.
controlling such an entity.
Yeah, I would be very shocked by that. I've always been one of these ones who thinks that's not going to pan out, like this AI thing.
Hmm.
And so ChatGPT was a shock for me, and I had to reevaluate some credences and stuff because
Yeah.
it does very well. It does. You do get the feeling of conversing with a kind of semi-intelligent or intelligent of a learning of intelligence there. So I was surprised that you could get that from predictive models. I think a lot of people were. But so you have to sort of reevaluate that stuff. But yes, if there were really frog-like things roaming around, um, I think that would be very shocking. And I think I would have to backpedal on a lot of this stuff. I would not be someone. So I'm not saying that if you built the robotic frog and it was hopping around and you stepped on it and it made it withdrawals and was limping around. I would say, I feel bad for Roombas that get stuck in the corner. So I
Yeah.
think that they so much should help those Roombas, and I'm not even joking. Like I feel like we kind of have a duty. Like if you just walk by a Roomba that's bumping into the corner, I feel like you did something wrong to the Roomba.
Yeah.
So, and I don't even think it has consciousness. I just think that it has a kind of
Yeah.
internal drive that is being foiled, and it's just all things considered. You shouldn't stand in the way if you don't have to. So I think those kind of considerations and any sort of precautionary principle and all that, like if the thing were there, the default is like it's probably conscious. We don't want a moral disaster on our hands. We don't want some view like this to lead us into a terrible moral disaster. So the way I think about robots is, yeah, when they show up and are interesting, then that's one thing, but they haven't and they aren't. So maybe that will
Right.
change, and by 10 years
So
from now,
here's
I could be
where I'm
looking
a
at this
swallow,
as
maybe, and you're a mole to appeal to this, right? So you want to stay focused on what do we have currently empirical evidence for, and let's not speculate beyond that.
yeah.
And I'm saying, let's speculate. I mean, I care.
No,
It
I'm
seems to
saying
me
let's
like we should
speculate, but
make
let's
our best guesses about what would happen if.
I'm saying let's speculate, but let's like qualify the speculation
Yeah.
with a downgrader because of its
Downgrade.
speculative nature.
Yeah, yeah, that's totally fair. And if you want to say 75% materialism, 25% the rest, that's not, in my view, that different from me. I'm in the ballpark of 50% materialism. And we haven't really talked about what I call the compromise slash rejection views, which is actually where the bulk of my non-materialist thinking goes,
Interesting.
especially property dualism and transcendental idealism are both views that, although I would bet on materialism, straightforward materialism over those, I feel the pull of both of those types of views
Yeah, me
pretty
too.
substantially.
So
Um,
transcendental idealism, that's good that you brought that up because I agree with you. But so this is why I was bringing up the analytical idealism because I think of that as a kind of successor to those views, except they want to say something about what's the noumenal thing is. But the
right.
transcendental idealist, and this is something you bring out really clearly in your book, which is really great, that we're really limiting our imagination when it comes to trying to conceive of like taking seriously this idea that the noumenal world isn't like the world we experience.
Right.
So I like the idea of the non-physical angels singing as far as a computation. But then you try to take it a bit further. So when you talk about transcendental idealism, you usually are confronting yourself to spatial
Right.
stuff. But then you want. So I wonder about the step from there to the rest of it, and what you think is your assigning of views there.
Right. So I regard transcendental. So Kant is, of course, the famous transcendental idealist, and some people, when they use the phrase transcendental idealism, just mean Kant's view.
Yeah.
But
So
I
you
want
got
to,
Kant's prime. Yeah, we don't have to deal with that.
right.
Yeah,
I want to
yeah.
use it in a broader sense, and how it relates to Kant is going to be complicated. But in the broad sense that I'm using the view, transcendental idealism is composed of two main theses. One is that we don't know the fundamental nature of things. And the other aspect is that spatiality is something that arises as a feature of our minds. And I think that, yeah, and then Kant wants to say something about temporality and causality also
All
arising as
12
features of our
categories,
minds.
baby.
All the
Ouch.
categories, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to focus on spatiality because I think that's the easiest case to think of. And if you give the transcendental idealist spatiality, then I think you have a contrast with the materialist position because I'm treating the materialist position as committed to spatiality not being a feature of our minds.
Right.
Right? Maybe spatiality is a fundamental feature of things, or maybe it's a derivative feature of some more fundamental feature, but it doesn't arise from our minds
Yeah.
if you are a materialist. So I think that is a commitment of materialism that if we can establish the falsity of it, then we have a contrast to a materialist view.
Right.
And then you can talk about temporality too, or causality, or whatever else, kind of as a next step if you want.
Okay, so what is I mean, so you don't endorse Kant's argument for the ideality of space, do you? Or okay, you give three kind of
I'm not
reasons for
sure what his
thinking of.
argument is.
Yeah.
He presents it as a picture.
Yeah.
I think Kant presents it as an appealing picture.
Okay.
The positive arguments are, in my mind, harder to evaluate and to extract and sketchier.
Yeah. So you don't appeal to this. Well, what would it mean to have an experience of something that wasn't in space, or these kinds of things that kind of point out that it's a preconception of experience that there's space. You don't rely on that kind of
I don't rely
transcendental
on
argument.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I my aim in the chapter of the book Kant Meets Cyberpunk, which is the chapter that I talk about this, is
Yeah.
just to kind of warm up the reader to seeing it as a live possibility.
Right.
And I do it through a certain kind of science fictional imaginative exercise where we start with the conception that we're living in a simulation and then think about, okay, that seems at least conceivable. Now, there are people who have argued against it even being conceivable, but I think, the majority of kind of the bulk of the philosophical reflections suggest that, well, it's conceivable at least. So we live inside a simulation.
Right. Matrix
So,
4.
Matrix 4. So, and then to combine that with some thoughts about the nature of computation, going back to Turing, right? Computation does not have to be spatial. Computation essentially involves, having different kinds of states, different kinds of symbols and state transitions. There's nothing about this that's inherently spatial. Could have a computation entirely within an immaterial, non-spatial soul.
Mm-hmm.
So that if we put those two thoughts together, we end up with the thought that, okay, it's conceivable. I'm not saying it's likely. It's conceivable that we live in a simulation that's instantiated in a non-spatial computer. And then, right, number one, we don't really know what that computer would be like.
Right.
We don't really know the fundamental nature of how that computer is working. That gives us part one of transcendental idealism. And part two, the computer is not spatial, right? Ex hypothesize, right? And you could start to think of spatiality as simply our way of dealing with the fundamental non-spatial structure. It kind of presents itself to us in this spatial way.
Right.
So then spatiality is something that's really a feature of our pattern of interacting with things. It's how we make sense of this fundamentally non-spatial reality. And if you grant both of those things as a kind of coherent metaphysical picture, then you've got already a form of transcendental idealism as I've defined it.
Right.
And then the final move is we can think, okay, like that we're in a simulation in a non-spatial computer is not like we're likely, right? But that there's some fundamental reality that maybe is very different from what we suppose it to be and that we don't really know. And that spatiality is just our way of kind of experiencing this impossible to understand to us fundamental reality. That doesn't sound so ridiculous to me. I think
Right.
maybe that's the right way to think about things. Now, again, it's not my primary. I'm kind of a little bit more of a mainstream materialist if you had to push me really, but I feel the pull of that. I think that we ought to reserve a little bit of our philosophical thinking for that way of understanding things.
I've thought that it might even be the case that you could have brains be doing something interesting in those kind of cases. So it might still be the case that you only get consciousness like ours in that non-physical simulation when there's non-physically simulated brains.
Yes, absolutely.
So
that could totally be the case.
In a way, right? It's sort of it's beyond that dispute in a way that's even more bizarrely fundamental. But I don't want to get distracted by that because when I was reading about this, and I like this view. I've known that you've had this view for a long time. But I wonder how you think it relates to views like Donald Hoffman's. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he goes around saying,
I am.
Physics has shown this. Physics has shown that space is a headset that we use to, it's a dashboard, it's a headset, and he's got these arguments. I'm not doing a good job of my Hoffman impression, but he this is his view, which sounds sort of like what you would classify as transcendental idealism, maybe. But I wonder, is this like in that category, or have you thought about Hoffman's view at all?
I've thought about Hoffman's view. I think he is some sort of idealist, either a metaphysical idealist or transcendental idealist. I'm not sure exactly which. I don't accept that physics has shown this to be the case. I think it's good that he's out there kind of putting out this view because I think we should accept it as a live option.
Right.
But when he says things like evolution selects for survival, not for accuracy, therefore, and the argument gets very quick.
Yeah.
Therefore, it follows that we don't have access to some mind-independent truth. In my experience, when I read his recent book and some of his, at least maybe two of his papers on this, that set of philosophical moves goes by very quickly in a way that I don't find compelling. So it's an interesting view that he's putting out there, but I don't find that the positive case for the view is as well developed as I'd like to see.
I see. Okay, so you don't think that the holographic hypothesis and these various other speculative ideas from fundamental physics are is it that you don't think they could be relevant, or you just don't think they are right now?
Well, like the holographic hypothesis from physics, I don't think that establishes idealism.
Mm-hmm. It's supposed to establish the emergentism of space, so the non-fundamentality of space, which might be in a related category if you think, well, gee, it's only at our level that this emerges. I mean, it's
Right. So okay. So when I was defining physicalism and its relationship to space, actually I prefer materialism over physicalism. I've been using physicalism, and maybe it's more common these days, but we could get into that. Well, I think materialism says fundamental stuff is matter, and physicalism says fundamental stuff is what physics tells us it is. And those are slightly different things. If physics ends up being idealist or dualist, then making physicalism synonymous with what we think of currently physicalism being is going to be a problem. So
right.
I think materialism is a more robust phrasing of things against those kinds of future possibilities for physics. But anyway,
I mean, that's what Strawson calls physicalism.
Right. Right. Exactly.
So I would usually take the physical, just mean physical, not physics, but physicalism, not physicsism.
Yeah, how you define what's physical is the big mess, right?
Yeah.
But right. So when I was characterizing materialism or physicalism earlier, I was careful to say that spatiality either is a fundamental feature of things in themselves, or it's not a fundamental feature, but it arises from the fundamental features of things in themselves in a way that does not depend on our minds.
Right.
Right. So the holographic hypothesis in physics is compatible with physicalism or materialism as kind of the second of those conjuncts. The holographic hypothesis does not show that spatiality depends on our minds. It just shows that spatiality, if it's true, just shows that spatiality is not fundamental, right? And then to say that it depends on our minds is a further move. And I think for Hoffman to get to that, he has to use his evolutionary selection argument.
I see.
And that, I think, is where...
Right, exactly. Things go
one
quick.
Of the weaknesses in that's where he's quick.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Okay, very interesting. So I see we're getting on in time. I can't keep you forever, although there's a million things we haven't even scratched the surface of in your very interesting work here. But I wonder if there's something that you were wanting to have come up or to talk about that we haven't talked about. The answer can be no, by the way, but I always like to check to see if there was something you were expecting or you wanted to mention or bring up.
No, not in particular. That's been a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's been a very great conversation. If you have a couple minutes, I give a couple questions from the listeners.
Sure.
So there seems to be something. Some people asking about your commitment to physicalism and saying that it's largely a product of, well, that you give it too much credence, so it should be a lot lower than around 50%. And I wonder why you think, all things considered, having all of these wonderful, bizarre views on the table, that physicalism still gets up to that level. I guess they're not putting it exactly that way, but that's sort of what I would interpret.
Right.
And by the way, if you have quick questions, put them in the chat. If you have for the next couple of minutes, you can stick around. But anyway, so I wonder why even close to 50? Shouldn't it be more like 9? Because how many views are there? There's more.
Yeah. Right. So the way that I parse up the possibility space here, the theoretical space, is you've got materialism or physicalism, you've got substance dualism, you've got idealism, and then you've got these compromise / rejection view, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by substance dualism, they're immaterial souls. I'm kind of inclined to think empirical evidence is not so good for that. Idealism is pretty bizarre. It seems like the kind of thing that you'd really need a very strong argument to win yourself over to. I don't see that really strong argument.
So wait, do you think that physics is against dualism because of causal closure and stuff? Or just no evidence of interaction?
Is one problem. Right, no evidence of interaction, no evidence of immaterial souls.
Okay.
Right, it's kind of like there are lots of ways it could empirically have been confirmed, right? And then the evidence keeps going against those empirical confirmations. Like William James and all these guys were trying to do seances, like, oh yeah,
Yeah, they took it serious. Yeah, exactly.
They took it seriously, really. And it's kind of feels to me a little bit like a view in retreat. It's like it keeps having to insulate itself from the scientific evidence in order to survive.
So what about quantum dualism, though, like of the Chalmers variety? You're not, that doesn't get in?
Just recent stuff on the collapse of the wave function.
Yeah.
The Queen. Yeah, I haven't tried to map that onto the categories. Think about whether that's substance or property. I was assuming that would be a property kind of dualism, since that's Chalmers' favorite view.
Yeah, I would see that as a substance dualism. The mind's outside of physical reality interacts with the collapse of the wave function.
Yeah,
but there's room for dispute. Yeah, okay, so interesting. So those views.
So those views get only a minority of my, kind of smallish minority of my personal credence. So then, as I said, property dualism and transcendental idealism, I feel the pull of them. But, at root, I think it's a pretty appealing story to think that the world is just the physical material world that we think it is. That seems to be the way that science is pointing us. As you were saying, Richard, the violations against common sense seem a little less severe than for some of these other views. It's got a certain kind of simplicity and elegance to it, right? There's no other stuff besides just the physical stuff, and we're just naturally evolved things, right? So all of that stuff
draws you in.
It draws me in, and I see the appeal of these other views, and I see some of the weaknesses and criticisms of it, but
So when you say, if I had to bet, does that mean that you have transcended credence into I believe physicalism is true? Or do you still would you reject that characterization that you have a belief that physicalism is true? And forget about the debates about belief. I know you have a lot to say about what a belief. I know you do, Eric.
Whoa,
oh no, you did destroy the background. I thought that was a virtual background this whole time. Holy skepticism, Batman. Okay.
I think when I'm not being a philosopher and reflecting on things carefully, I kind of just assume that physicalism is true, or materialism, as I prefer to call it. Right? I think that's kind of my default state of mind, and I have to kind of remind myself of the alternative possibilities and the challenges to it. And when I make those vivid, then I find myself in the ballpark of 50%. Yeah.
Where you want to leap in the quad, which is we didn't get to talk about the practical implications of all this stuff. But really quickly, someone's asking about aphantasia. And your views about aphantasia and over relying on introspection. So, I think of myself as someone who has aphantasia, which I discovered by studying philosophy. And it made me wonder, did I always have it, or did I not have it as a kid and I hit my head and lost it? I don't remember, but I can't make mental images. But I guess the gist of the question is maybe it's over relying on introspection.
Right. I'm contemplating writing a paper about aphantasia. So in the early 2000s, I did a review of the literature, quite a thorough review of the literature on the accuracy of introspective reports about imagery. And I came to a very pessimistic conclusion that basically there's no relationship between people's introspective reports of individual differences in imagery capacity and their actual differences in imagery capacity. There are hundreds of published attempts to find correlations between introspective reports of imagery capacity and things like visual memory, visual rotation, mental folding, all this kind of stuff you think might be related. And basically, it's a goose egg. I mean, you find a smattering of positive results. Most of those don't replicate. There's probably a positive publication bias in the literature, which would explain that smattering of positive results. So I decided and I published this in 2008, and then it became part of my 2011 book, that basically the empirical evidence suggests the relationship, but people who say they're poor imagers versus good imagers, probably there's no correlation between that and their real imagery capacity.
This is the Perplexities of Consciousness book.
This is in Perplexities of Consciousness, my 2011 book. So since then, there's been this big literature on aphantasia has arisen, where people are claiming to find empirical differences between people who claim to be aphantasic, that is, have no visual imagery experiences, and neural states that you might think would be associated with imagery and maybe some performance on tasks. Now, when I've looked in that literature, I have found the evidence not wholly compelling.
Okay.
But I haven't yet done a thorough theoretical review of the literature to assess whether I really want to maintain the skepticism. So my current position on that is I'm not going to accept at face value that aphantasia is a real phenomenon of the sort that people seem to say and think it is now.
Interesting.
But I'm open to that possibility. I think
so
we
just to
want
be
to go
clear
slow
here,
on it and look carefully at the empirical evidence on this with a critical eye, given the history of poor correlations.
How bad we've done on this.
Yeah.
So just to be so that I'm clear on this, the error is on the imagers side, so they're wrong, not me, because I think I can't do it. Like when someone says image an apple, I can't. Like I get pure. Maybe like I cognize an apple or do something. I feel something, but it's not visual in any way. I can't picture an apple. So I'm right about that, or I'm wrong about that, or I'm just as right as the person who thinks they like. My son claims to be able to like vividly picture the apple. Like according to him, it's as real as seeing it. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I tried to convince him he might be wrong about it. He was like, no, I'm doing it right now. He's like, I'm not listening to you. I'm looking at the apple. I was like, okay. So the view is that there's a mistake on his part or my part, or both.
It could be both. It could be a linguistic dispute, right? So it could be, and this is maybe simplistic, but just to give a flavor of the kind of linguistic dispute it could be that when you say you're not having an image, you have an idea of what an image must be to count as an image that makes it closely resemble what it is to visually experience something, right? And you're like, I don't have that, right? And your son, when he thinks about what it is for an image to be real, doesn't have to resemble vision as vividly, and he's like, I do have that. Now maybe you have exactly the same thing when someone asks you to imagine an apple. Like, okay, imagine an upright apple and there's a stem on the top and there's a leaf coming out of the stem and the apple is red, right? Maybe you guys are kind of doing the same thing, but you're like, given what an image has to be, this doesn't qualify as an image. And your son is, this qualifies as an image. What else could it be, right? So that would be one way of thinking about it, is just a linguistic dispute.
Yeah, it seems hard to sustain that, given that he claims it's just as good as actual vision.
Well, but he's not like reaching for his. I mean,
he could draw it though. He can draw it from what he pictures, whereas I can't
draw what I just described.
I can't draw what I think I'm picturing in any way, and I would deny that I have anything that's visual. So it's not that there's an image.
What does it mean for something to be visual?
Involving light and the distribution of it, maybe.
There's no light in a visual image.
It seems like
do you have auditory imagery, right? So do you like?
Yeah, I think I do, and I dream. I think
running through your head.
I dream in images.
Yeah, right. So that's an interesting thing, right? And so if you think about like a tune running through your head or saying something to yourself silently in inner speech, or you could see how someone would say, well, that's real. I'm really imagining that in inner speech, but it's not like I'm hearing something, right? So there's a sense in which it's as real as hearing something, but there's another sense in which it is not a kind of hearing at all.
Yeah, so it might be like the animal-human case, sort of, in a way, that they're saying it's not hearing because there's no thing out there which is making the sound.
Right, and it resembles hearing in some respects, but not in others. Like it doesn't have a volume.
Yeah.
Right, but it's got a pace.
I think it can have a volume.
Speech is maybe a little faster.
I can't imagine.
You can shout to yourself in inner speech versus whispering, and that's a volume thing, not just like a
100%.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe. I don't know. People give different reports about inner speech too. I mean, I think all of these,
Well, I'm thinking
I mean,
because someone asked
the
me
whole idea
once.
of my 2011 book is people give such different reports about their experiences,
Exactly.
really very different, and they're pretty confident about them as you are and as I kind of expressed. But then you try to hook it up with like actual behavioral differences,
Yeah.
and it doesn't hook up very well. And actually, people can be moved pretty easily to change their views about these things, even when they
Hmm.
sound confident.
Hmm.
And one of the striking things about this, and this is in my 2007 book, right? So this is an experience sampling method that Russ Hurlburt developed, and I collaborated with him on, where you wear a beeper during your ordinary experience, and then the beep goes off, and you're supposed to report on what was in the last moment of undisturbed experience right before the beep.
Right.
And here's something that will happen. On the first day, someone will say, "Oh, I'm constantly talking to myself in inner speech." Or they'll say, "I have visual images all the time." And then you beep them, and they
And
seem
there's none of
confident
that.
about that. And you beep them, and there's none of that. And then you
Yeah.
say, "Oh, this is interesting. Before we did the beeping, you said, I'm talking to myself in inner speech all the time. And now we've done 12 beeps, and you have 0 instances of inner speech, or 1,
Right.
right? Which do you think is correct? Do you think that your generalization initially was correct, or do you think that these specific reports are correct?"
Yeah.
And people will say, "Oh, it's the specific reports. My generalization was wrong," even though it seemed like they were confident and they were basing it upon their knowledge of their own experience, right? So it could be the same with aphantastics. It would not surprise me. Let me
That's
just say
very
this would
interesting.
fit with my experience with beeping with Hurlburt. It would not surprise me if a substantial portion of aphantasics, if you beep them, would say, "Oh, well, I guess I did have imagery in that case," despite the fact that they're like, "Oh yeah, I don't have."
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. So, do you take the same view about blindsight? Just curiously, out of curiosity, that is probably degraded vision that they don't want to classify, or you're neutral on
That
that.
is my guess about blind sight.
Uh-huh.
Again, I haven't done a really thorough review of the literature on blind sight, so I'm not ready to kind of publish this guess or stand behind it publicly. But that is my guess based on what I've read about it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Um, so I guess I have a question now that it comes. I see some other questions that are lining up, so I I don't want to overstep my.
I do have a hard stop of noon my time, 3 your time.
Okay, yes, I also because I have kids getting off the bus. So we'll have to wrap up very quickly. But I wonder how this fits with your innocence of consciousness stuff, because it does seem like not so innocent after all when you drill down on it. Maybe some of the innocence comes from our not beeping people. And if we did, we would find, I mean, challenging them on what they're saying, basically. So I wonder, do you think this is in tension with that idea that, look, we just know when we see it, we have examples, that's how we define it. But then when you press people on it, actually,
I think we know that we're conscious,
yeah.
but I think we know some basic structural facts about obvious cases. But I think it doesn't take long to get to medium-sized structural facts about which we can be very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. So I'm very skeptical about introspective reports about conscious experience, including whether you are a non-imager, right? And what it's like to have a visual experience right now, right? But I cannot authentically doubt that I am currently having visual experience as I'm thinking about it right now, looking at my image on YouTube, right? It's just like there I feel that Cartesian certainty, that inability to doubt that I'm having visual experience. Now you start asking me structural details about the visual experience, like how stable is it, right? What is the periphery of the experience, right? Did I have visual experience 5 minutes ago when I wasn't thinking about having visual experience? Those kinds of
Exactly.
questions I think we can often go wrong, right? But that I'm having visual experience right now, or I drop a barbell on my toe and it hurts, right? It's like,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm feeling pain right now. I can't authentically doubt it. So my skepticism goes pretty far, but not that far. And then my definition of consciousness hinges on those kinds of cases about which we're not skeptical, right? Like that visual experience, that's a case, right? That
Uh-huh.
barbell on the toe, that's a case, right? Think about those cases. They have an obvious property in common. Consciousness is just that obvious property they have in common.
All right, so one more just on this. So did I hear you correctly as saying that you don't have a 1% skeptical belief in illusionism? Like that doesn't get even a point oh something something that you could be wrong right now. I mean, Chalmers told me he does, and I was like pretty blown away by that. That he assigned some small credence to illusionism being true, and I was like, but like the hardcore kind of illusionism where it's a limitivism basically about phenomenal consciousness. But it sounds like you were saying no because you know that.
Right. Yeah. So there are some skeptical possibilities in which I invest much less than a 0.01 or 0.1% credence, and one of them is that I've never had any conscious experiences, and I'm not having one now. So regarding illusionism in particular, like Frankish's and Kammerer's version, I actually think that's just a linguistic dispute.
Yeah.
And we don't disagree in substance. I don't think they're illusionists in the kind of radical, crazy seeming sense of denying what I think it's fair to call the basic Cartesian fact that I'm having experiences right now.
Right.
They're gonna say, oh, well, as soon as you use that term, phenomenal consciousness, you're importing some anti-naturalistic suppositions. I think as soon as you use this term, you're not importing necessarily anti-naturalistic suppositions. And so I think that the disagreement I have with them is about whether into the very concept of phenomenal consciousness is ineliminably built anti-naturalistic assumptions or not. I think not. They think yes. So that I think there's a terminological dispute, and the question of like kind of the Cartesian question, they don't have the kind of almost impossible to believe view about that. That's my interpretation of the illusionism debate.
I share that, but when you tell them that, they disagree with you. So, yeah. I mean, I try to tell Keith that
we go around about
yeah.
this, but that's what I've come to. That's how I interpret it.
Yes, I'm on board with that. Well, I'm sorry we can't keep you longer, Eric, but this conversation has been so interesting. I can't recommend this book, The Weirdness of the World, enough. All of your previous books have been interesting and exciting too, but this one really, I think, is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting in the sense of really pushing out these strange, seemingly bizarre ideas and challenging us to take them serious. And I think, as I said before, I think this is philosophy at its best. I super applaud it. Someone's got to be a swallow, so I enjoy both. I like mulling and swallowing. I guess I don't know, but I think we need both kinds of philosophers out there. So I highly appreciate your work. Anyway, I'll let you go. Hang out for 1 second. I'll say bye off air. Other than that, thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, we are off air. Wow.
All right.
Thank you so much. That was a great conversation. That was so much fun. I mean, I meant everything I said.
Always fun chatting.
Got a happy